Hi, and welcome to the concurrent session, Plans for Lasting Change, DEI Strategy for Long-Term Success. I'm Jen Geller, the Senior Editor of the Workforce Executive Council and Director of Programming for Events and Councils at CNBC. So if you like this event, thank you very much. If you don't, your organization likely gave a hard look at its DEI strategy this year to make sure your culture is inclusive and has a more diverse talent pipeline for years to come. Today's discussion focuses on strategies, large and small, that are helping your organization meet long-term DEI goals. It's an open forum discussion led by three of our WEC members: Celeste Warren, Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence at Merck; Cara Hellender, Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at the Carlyle Group; and Matt Breitfelder, Global Head of Human Capital and Senior Partner, Apollo Capital Management. We want all of you to take part in the conversation too. So raise your hand or comment in the chat if you have something to add. It's Chatham House rules, so speak freely. We're recording this just so members who didn't have a chance to check it out can, and it'll be on a password-protected member portal. Cameras on, mute when you aren't speaking. We practice really good Zoom etiquette or conference etiquette here. And before we kick things off, I want to turn things over to our sponsor, Alexander Alonso, Chief Knowledge Officer at SHRM. Alex?
Thanks, Jen, and thank you all for allowing us to participate and sponsor this great event. I want to give my thanks to CNBC, but more importantly to the workforce executives that make up this council. As you all know, following the killing of George Floyd and other events throughout our summer of discontent, discussions permeated our workplaces, especially discussions around racial justice. All over the country, we found leaders, managers, and coworkers trying to have difficult conversations about race. And one of the things that struck me is that it made it incumbent upon us as leaders to really be more comfortable with the notion of being uncomfortable, especially if we're going to help our staff and our workforce do this and really resolve the issue of racial inequity. As HR leaders, I look forward to learning from you all here today and encourage you to promote respectful conversation as far as the realities of inclusion, equity, and diversity throughout your workforce. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to learning from you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Let's kick things off. What's the most promising DE&I initiative you're working on? Where are you getting the most traction that we can all learn from? Matt Breitfelder, let's start things off with you.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be with everyone today. As Alex said, we have a tremendous amount of work to do on this topic and in this space. At Apollo, we're very focused on becoming very strong champions of diversity and inclusion at every level of our firm. It's one of our firm values, and I'm incredibly focused on how we operationalize that for everyone who works in our organization. And we really do that in a couple of different ways. One is all about education. I think, as Alex said, we have so much work to do on race and discrimination and helping people understand the history of race and discrimination and to just go deeper into all of the related issues. I think we've also got tremendous research from people like Mahzreen Banaji, Scott Page, Iris Bonet, who are helping all of us understand unconscious bias, how it works. And I think Iris's book in particular, What Works, how do you operationalize and take action on that in HR jobs like ours? And I'll just give two small examples. I think when you think about D&I, and I work in a very analytical organization, so I'm focused on how do you hardwire the changes that we all need to make in our organization. So we're getting good traction on increasing our diversity. I'm a big believer in simplicity, the idea of a very simple dashboard. Here's your representation, here's your talent pool, here's your hiring, here's your promotions, and just help every business leader really see on a quarterly basis how they're doing, making their teams more diverse, knowing we have conviction around diverse teams outperform. That's one tool. The other tools on the I side, I think all of us who conduct annual employee engagement surveys, it's so helpful to be able to look through the lens of each demographic group and to say, what are those gaps between the overall average and the experience of women, of people of color, of other underrepresented groups? and then get very specific and surgical about what are the biggest gaps, why do they exist, and what are we going to do about it. And I want to operationalize that every one of our leaders has those tools so we can get very specific with them about what they need to do differently.
Matt, you bring up a good point about making sure that everybody feels that they have a role around driving the change we want to see. And we at Merck, we have a great CEO in Ken Frazier, who really is very vocal about D&I and equity. And also he makes sure that his senior leaders, his direct reports, are also embracing it as well and operationalizing it. But one of the key aspects of any type of change strategy, especially in this space, is around your first line managers, first and second line managers, and making sure that they're engaged. And what we found is that a lot of our senior leaders in at that next cusp level, that they're talking amongst each other about what they're doing, but they're not talking below to their managers and laying out very clear expectations around what they expect from them in their organization around DE&I. So I think it's really, really critical when we think about initiatives, if we forget about those first and second line managers and the role they play, we're not going to be able to drive the change we want to see.
Yeah, and I, similar to Matt, and I'm sure Celeste as well, we all work in organizations where there is a lot of very analytical people. So, having some of the data that Matt referenced is absolutely important. Giving people, in essence, holding up the mirror. That's a powerful concept in behavioral science, and I've seen it be incredibly powerful here because, we all know that we perpetuate sort of the behaviors that we're used to, and that's a helpful way of beginning to interrupt it. So we also provide on a quarterly basis that kind of a snapshot to each of our leaders, and it actually is part of their quarterly business review as well. So they're speaking to how they're actively driving change. I also would echo what Celeste said about oftentimes I think in an organization it becomes it can feel like, oh, this is something that senior leadership has to drive, and senior leadership absolutely has to be at the forefront of this. But there's power in also helping every individual inside the organization understand what action they can take. So that we are moving next year to having each one of our employees articulate a diversity, equity, and inclusion objective. And we're giving them those tools and that insight to understand what it is within their day-to-day and within their sphere of influence that they can do that will make a change. Because that's all about rewiring some of the norms in the organization. The other thing that I am a huge fan of is rewiring our systems, processes, and our norms. One of the things that I'm encouraged by in this moment in time is the fact that, some of those changes are new, they're kind of uncomfortable, but how we're positioning them is we're saying to people, you said what you wanted to know what you can do. These are some of the things that you can do. And so we're finding people being much more receptive, much more willing to, engage in a process that's different from what they've done in the past because of the recent events, and the kind of concern, desire to be active participants in change.
Yeah, that's great. Are there others who are kind of doing something similar or something very different? I think that first line manager actually is a huge sense of ownership. Is anyone, and I know, Anna Avalos, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know that you're always very thoughtful on some of these things. And I also know that data and analytics, especially in financial firms, are important. Is there anything that you're doing there? And others, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We certainly are building out dashboards and continuing to kind of rethink about, number one, also like making sure we're capturing the data in thoughtful ways and sharing it out with the leadership and sharing it out honestly broader within the organization. It's a lot around what others have spoke on. The other thing that we've been really focusing on is the community once you join the company. So we launched a mentorship program specifically targeted at our URM population, actually just recently, and carved out headcount for entry-level hires from military and campus for the first time ever. We're a pretty young company. And then also identified career pathways for our customer service employees to move into entry-level roles within the organization. So how do we help to kind of allow people to build a career at SoFi, where we know we've got a lot of diversity within our call center population. So really helping them to build a career within the company. And we've always really been very active in helping to support continued education. So leaning into that to really help to build out our workforce within the organization.
Hi, this is Cindy Pace from MetLife, and just great to hear all the wonderful things that are happening at the different companies here represented. Well, what we're doing a lot, and that's one thing you'll always hear from chief diversity officers and D&I practitioners is that we're trying a lot of different things to make sure that we get this right. What we've done is really focus more on what I call some of the things that will make or break your initiatives, and that's the systemic, addressing the systemic barriers, really looking at what are the practices that are taking place in the organization that we need to fix. And so that's one piece. The other is, someone had also mentioned this around transparency. So this year, one of the things that we did was we said, okay, we want to be on a pathway to greater transparency. And one way we will start is just to share where we are and what we're committed to. And so in our sustainability report this year, we just broke it down and said, hey, this is what we are committed to around D&I. So it was very apparent what we're trying to fix, what needs to get better, what's already great, so people can really see, how we're doing in this say-do space and where are the gaps. The last thing was, we've done a lot on representation and metrics and all of those things, but the I became very important in the wake of COVID and the racial and civil unrest in the United States and really around the world. So we use that opportunity to build the courage muscle, to have more conversations that built trust and built psychological safety within teams. Because if there's no trust, there's no psychological safety, there's no creativity, there's no innovation, there's no collaboration. So that's just a little bit of what we've been doing at MetLife.
I love that.
You bring up a good point about transparency. You bring up a good point about transparency. It's something that we all, as D&I and professionals, that we struggle with not so much us. We want to tell it all and make sure that we're being transparent, both to our internal employees and also to our external environment, because that talks about your commitment around D&I. But I would be curious to hear from some of you, some of the struggles that you have, maybe with your legal department or some of your other leaders around that.
I don't know. Anyone having any struggles? Celeste, are you having? That's an interesting question. Tell me what you have. Yeah.
Well, luckily, our head of employment legal and I are close. She's another, and so we have really good, candid conversations around these subjects. We have a pay equity council that's also comprised of our head, my peer, that's head of global compensation and benefits. And we're doing really good work within the organization, but it's just it's sort of who lost the trust first. We're in a very litigious society. And so, everyone is, well, they're going to sue the company. They're going to sue the company. This, you keep hearing that over and over again. And it's like, but we have a good story to tell. Why can't we tell it? So we keep doing the work, and we've been having the conversations, and we're starting to really open up a little bit more and more and more, especially, and the argument that I always tell to my colleagues is our investors are asking for it. And so, this isn't just a Celeste thing, but our investors, I'm being pulled in more and more and more investor calls where they're asking about ESG, they're asking about diversity and inclusion, they're asking all these questions. And so, we can't just say, well, we don't share that and watch your share price drop to the floor.
Celeste, you bring up a great point, and that was one of the reasons why we leveraged the sustainability report, because investors, our shareholders are saying, how well are you doing around DE&I? That is a huge part, of ESG, and looking at, does your company create value if you are a publicly held, publicly traded company? And so actually those efforts, to your point, that push from the external can actually help us drive change internally. We are really in the moment of transparency, and only year over year is there going to be greater request for us to release data, release numbers, the pay equity that you talked about. This was the first year that we had, I would say, a more robust statement that people really wanted to know, how are you running this? How are you actually doing your, pay equity research? And what happens year over year? So I think many of us, I see a lot of head nodding. We're getting some support from external on becoming more transparent.
Yeah, I would echo that. There's there's a dance, Celeste, that was very resonant for me in what you said in terms of building the rationale, establishing the comfort with your legal team to be a bit more explicit about some of the things that you're doing and some of the metrics and the progress that's being made. I wish I had a magic wand or a good solve for it. I think it's just, I think your point of more and more of our key stakeholders are asking for it, using it as a measure of success for the organization. And that's a good thing. And I think the more that continues to happen, the more progress we'll be able to make on it. Absolutely. I also think the comments around psychological safety are absolutely fascinating. And also, I would say we've found it really successful, even equipping people with some of the context and the language to use if they suspect that bias is happening in a decision-making process. We recently redesigned the way our promotion committees operate to help to weave that in. And just having that to reference and the words to begin to use to raise really helped people be more upfront when they suspected that we weren't being as objective as we wanted to be. And so we found that those discussions and those decisions were way more robust, just giving people the safety of language to use.
Beverly, it looks like you have a question. Did you want to jump in, Beverly?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I was just wanting to get a couple of examples, dealing with systemic racism within your organization. That's everything from the processes to even some of your policies. I'm just curious as to some of the initiatives you maybe have addressed in looking at that. And then kind of subsequently, I'm very interested in the whole aspect around psychological safety. So thank you for delving into it, but I'm very curious of how you are approaching that within your organization and, some of the reception that you've received in that, as well as some of the other additional initiatives that you're looking at in addressing it going forward.
I can share some of the work that we're doing. I'm Monica. I lead diversity and inclusion at Kayak and Open Table. And we're thinking a lot about sort of the systematic injustice issue. We've done sort of two things. So my view is, definitely on the unconscious bias and understanding data. And then we're sort of taking a 360 view on how do we really integrate D&I into the core business. And so we're starting that sort of line by line, department by department. And the two areas where we've really gone deep on looking at our systems and our process are the first on our recruiting process. So we've gone very deep. When COVID happened, we actually paused hiring as a company, and we were able to redeploy our recruiters from their normal day-to-day into actually auditing our entire end-to-end recruiting experience to look at every single step for a candidate as they move through the process, how we source talent, where we source it from, how do we write job postings, every little minutia, and actually just having a map to be able to hold up to leaders and say, hey, did you know, right? Perhaps recruiting an engineer on the kayak side has a different set of standards than maybe on the open table side. And did you know they're the same job? Like, should those two things look the same, right? Having those types of conversations to really looking at, minimum requirements for hiring. I think, managers constantly have this philosophy of, I want that unicorn candidate. So I'm going to ask for the sun, the moon, and the stars. And we know that women and underrepresented groups in general need to feel that they have 100% or more than men do in terms of the job posting before they'll even apply. And so we're just cutting people out of the process. So we looked at that. And then on the marketing side, same sort of methodology as we mapped, how do we decide to publish, an asset or piece of creative? Has that been seen by a diverse review panel? Do we have a diverse set of content creators? And are we really looking for things and principles of where brands have really stepped sideways in these areas in tone and language, not understanding historical context before they talk about something? So really going very, very deep with marketers to set new process and policy.
Can I would just add one other thing to Annika's point, and really fascinating what you guys are doing, and also pick up Laura's question that's in the chat. I think one of the really important frontiers here to try to really equalize opportunity is the people analytics space is teaching us so much about the mythology of hiring criteria. So if you look at what Google has learned in their people analytics team under a guy named Prasad Sethi, GPA doesn't correlate to on-the-job performance. A piece of work I'm really proud of having done, and Cara and I used to work together at BlackRock. We used to get 20,000 resumes a year to hire 400 students into our analyst program. And we spent years trying to figure out how to get more diversity into the pipeline of the world's largest asset manager. And managers were so convinced they knew what the winning profile was, and that it tended to be people with technical majors from a very small subset of universities. And we started getting into people analytics, and we said, it's really interesting. We're still at the time at, 25, 30% women and 5% people of color in those classes because of the major profile. And then we just ran a very simple exercise. Well, let's just take a look at our own data, which isn't that complicated. It's not, you don't even need machine learning. And let's see what's the success profile. And is the hypothesis of the hiring managers, does it actually map to the success we've seen in our own company with the types of analysts we hired? And we actually found that liberal arts majors outperformed in every job category. So that's pretty interesting, because you'd never expect in a financial services firm like BlackRock that would be the case, even though I guess it made sense because the CEO himself was a liberal arts major. But that had a profound change to our talent strategy. We turned the whole thing on its head because the hiring managers were making the wrong decisions. They were using a reflex that wasn't backed up by any data other than their gut, and their gut was wrong. So as soon as we switched the profile, and schools didn't correlate either. So just because you can just hire from Ivy League schools doesn't mean you should do that, especially if it's not backed up by the performance in our actual company. So once we demythologized all of it, everything changed, and Cara led some incredible work that drove this. But we became majority women and 20 to 30% people of color like 4 or 5 years ago, simply because we looked at our own data, as Cara said earlier, looked in the mirror and realized that the assumptions by which we were making those decisions were wrong. And I think there are tons of examples of that in all of our companies. So to Beverly's point, if we're going to change a systemic problem, we need to look at the whole pipeline and say, what are the inefficiencies in decision-making at every step that are not backed up by anything other than reflex?
Well, one of the interesting things that you say about that is because in regards to unconscious bias, there's just unconscious processes. Oftentimes we do things because that's the way that it has been done, or because that's what you're supposed to do. And a lot of these things that we're supposed to do are the exact same behaviors and processes that lead to the inequalities that all of us experience. It would make sense, even though it wasn't always looked at that way, that someone who comes from a liberal arts background is a more well-rounded employee. Their experience and way of thinking and how they've navigated their life thus far isn't the traditional fixed path, so their mindset isn't fixed, which obviously leads to more innovation and imagination, and honestly, they can connect a lot better with a lot of other people because they've had interactions with a multitude of people. So it's kind of funny, when someone is in a finance major, or maybe that's not necessarily fair. I still would like my doctor to actually be a doctor. But a diverse education obviously is going to lead to more diverse people, which will lead to more diverse employees, which will lead to better companies. So right on point of, you've got to look back and become conscious of everything that you're doing. And I think the more that we can as HR professionals do that and help those around us do that, the greater chance it is that DEI just becomes a part of your culture. It's just a part of all of our lives, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, and I would build something, I fully support everything that you just said. And I think one of the other things I will mention is that part of the work that Matt referenced, we also looked at the kind of messaging that we were putting out to applicants, the people we were inviting to apply. And we did some, classic A/B testing research, but we found that there were messages that tripled the application rates from Black and Hispanic candidates. And they were messages in the invitation to apply that clearly articulated why a diverse set of backgrounds were really important to the business success. And so, I think, again, that's a simple change that's really scalable and easy to make. And what it does is it just signals to people that you're going to be welcome. And in fact, your background is going to be valuable to us. And so I think it's those kinds of, as Matt knows, I, with some of the behavioral scientists that we worked with at BlackRock, created the science of diversity and inclusion just to help us begin to uncover more of those changes to the systems that we can make that really are driving evidence-based impact.
I have to leave it there because we're about to rejoin at the main stage, but this was terrific. I know that we can go on for hours. And I know the council talks about all these things. Special thanks to SHRM and Alex Alonso and Cara, Matt, Celeste, and all of you. I always love these conversations. Let's head back to the main stage for even more cool and interesting conversations. We're really excited that you all were able to join us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.